Paid for by A Common America. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. Learn more at www.acommonamerica.org.
Tom Daschle is an American politician who represented South Dakota in the U.S. Senate from 1987 through 2005. Senator Daschle has served as both minority and majority leader twice. He was a co-founder of the Bipartisan Policy Center. He remains incredibly active as a founder and chairman of the Daschle Group, where he provides strategic advice on national issues such as healthcare, energy, transportation, and the environment.
The one thing we typically ask most of the people we have on the show is, tell us about kind of your childhood in South Dakota and Aberdeen, and kind of what you learned about people and politics, and kind of how it shaped your, I guess I'll call it, political outlook later on in life.
Well, I had what I think would be described as an idyllic childhood, even though my father was a minimum wage worker. He was a bookkeeper. My mother was a housekeeper. I'm the oldest of four boys. Lost one brother to brain cancer about 10 years ago. But we grew up in a town of about 25,000, Aberdeen, South Dakota. I went to Catholic school. I had a first grade teacher who was a huge influence on me. Her name was Sister Morris Crowley. She was a big woman. She said she always wanted to be a temple of the Holy Spirit, and God made her a basilica instead. But she, at an early stage in her life, or in my life, she told me that she thought public service was the highest calling. And it's something I never forgot. And we stayed in close touch all the way through my early years in my political career until she passed. But she was a major influence. But other nuns in my school at the time, I went to 9 years of grade school, and I had a number of them that were quite influential. They taught me a love of history in particular. That taught me, I think, to a certain extent, to be interested in public affairs and what was happening in the world. I was an avid history buff, and especially American history, and I think that's really what led me. But I was a product of the 60s. I was in sixth grade when John Kennedy was sworn in as president. We went through the civil rights era in the 60s with my teenage years, and that had a profound impact on me as well. So at one point, I wasn't sure whether I wanted to be a pilot or a politician. I ended up being both, but I would not have been either had it not been for my education and the opportunities I had growing up in Aberdeen.
And can you kind of describe I'll call it the political climate in Aberdeen in your childhood? I assume small city in South Dakota was Republican, but I'll let you tell us about that.
Well, South Dakota was kind of a purple state when I was growing up, and my county, Brown County, leaned Democratic. It's a bright red state now, and we haven't seen a Democratic victory statewide in almost 20 years. But when I was growing up, it was pretty purple. My parents were not political at all. In fact, my father, I know, voted for Dwight Eisenhower twice. Told me that because he had so much admiration for him. My father served in World War II. He was at the Battle of the Bulge, and was a very proud military veteran. But politically, it was really something I acquired over time. The more I watched the civil rights movement, the more I became concerned about our involvement in Vietnam. I had thought about spending a good deal of my time professionally in the Air Force, and that was really what led me to join Air Force ROTC in college and sign up to be wanted to be a pilot. but I wasn't. As it turned out, I was an intelligence officer and got my pilot's license later. But politically, I think we were somewhat unengaged. I guess that's probably the best word as a family.
When you ran for the House, can you talk a little bit about that first cycle that you went through? What were your first impressions as you were sworn in and were meeting your colleagues in the House? Was it collegial, or how was the environment and the collaboration at the time, and how does it differ today in your perspective?
Well, I might go back just to give you a little bit of a story about how I got elected in the first place. I was a young 22 something staff person working for a United States Senator from South Dakota, Jim Aberesk. He called me into his office one day and told me that he wasn't going to run for reelection, and that that would likely mean that the congressman who was representing the district I was from, the first district in South Dakota, we had the two at the time. We now only have one. But he encouraged me to go back and try to run. I was 28 years old and had no money, no contacts, nothing. I said, well, I really can't imagine how I could possibly get elected to Congress. He said, just go back and knock on doors and go to as many doors as you can. I knocked on well over 20,000 doors, and got elected in South Dakota the first time by 14 votes. It took a year and 12 days, I believe it was, before I was officially declared the winner in that first election in 19. I started serving on a sort of a conditional basis in '79, and but it was sometime. I think it was. I can't remember the exact date now, but about a year and 12 days, I think it was, after the election, I was finally declared the winner. So I had a very precarious hold on that seat. But I had mentors right from the beginning who really taught me a lot. Mo Udall, a congressman from Arizona, was one of my mentors, and he encouraged me with that very narrow margin to run for a leadership position in the House. They called it regional whip. It was a position. There's a number of whip regions throughout the country, and he encouraged me to run. He said, "You can tell everybody that I'm supporting you." I did, and incredibly, I won that election, and that's really what gave me the opportunity to start at the lowest rung of leadership in the House with that very narrow margin. I went on, of course, to run again, and in 1980 that was a much easier election. And I might tell you, I know because of your interest in bipartisanship, I had the most unique election in 1980. I ran against a guy by the name of Bart Cull. He was a very famous broadcaster in South Dakota. He had never run for political office before, and as it turned out, my election went pretty well. I won a lot more comfortably than the first time, but he invited me over to his house that night to watch some of the returns and have a glass of wine. And then he came to my victory party and raised hands together and conceded victory in front of my supporters. It was just an amazing demonstration of civility and something I obviously never experienced since then.
Again, yes.
Been experienced very often anywhere in the country. But that was the kind of man and gentleman he was. And I went on in 1982 then. I had to run against the other congressman from South Dakota because we lost our congressional district, and was fortunate enough to win that one. I ran one more time for the House before running for the Senate in '86.
You think about today's elections and how close they often are and contested they are. It's so nice and refreshing to hear about a very collegial, election handover like that, and your experience there is really, really interesting. How do you think about today's House and the sort of tenor or tone of the discourse?
I'm deeply, deeply troubled by the tenor, the tone, the discourse. the tribalism, the confrontation. I have long believed, and I've said it a million times, that compromise is the oxygen of democracy. It is truly the oxygen of democracy. Without it, you can't legislate. Without legislation, you can't enact. Without enactment, you can't have full enforcement of the democracy that we all aspire to. So it is so critical. It is at its root, the core of our democracy. And I see so little of it today. And that troubles me a great deal. We don't have the kind of across the aisle collaboration, and there are many reasons for that. I can be happy to delve into my reasons why, but I think it's gotten worse, and it's gotten precariously dangerous for our democracy today. And so I just think it's why I think what you're trying to do with this podcast and your organization, why things like that are so important. We just can't do enough of it, and we've got to do as much as possible to try to bring it back.
I'm definitely interested in some of your thoughts on why why the tone has changed, has shifted in the House, and if you see any opportunities or specific ways where we can navigate back to more of a balanced. Everyone's not going to agree on everything, but we can at least have discussions and work through and find compromise. Do you see any path back?
Well, there's an old admonition that I know you both have heard 1,000 times. Be careful what you wish for. I was part of the reform movement in the late 60s and 70s, arguing that primaries were the best way to nominate a candidate because you wanted the people involved. I have to say, I still believe in elections, of course, but what concerns me about primaries today is, first of all, the incredibly low turnout. It's not uncommon to get a 15 or 20% turnout in a primary. What does that mean? That means the hard right and the hard left are the only ones who vote. What does that mean? That means the only people that get elected in primaries increasingly are those on the hard right and the hard left. So I think we've got to change our primary system. We've got to figure out a way, and some states have already done it. There are a number of ways you can do it, but we've really got to encourage primaries to bring people back to the middle. And ranked choice voting is one way to do it. Just picking the top two people who win, I think sometimes can do that too. But you've got to encourage, you've got to incent people to want to be driven towards the middle. And right now we're encouraging politicians to be driven to the extremes. And what that has led to a second issue. We have gerrymandered the entire country, both within the states and nationally. And your audience knows what gerrymandering is, so I'm not going to define it. But in the House, there's only about 15%, roughly 50 votes that are competitive today in a general election. All of the others are predetermined. We already know who's going to win in almost all of the congressional districts outside of those 50. So that gerrymandering has also created a tendency to be extreme because there's no competition. You're competing again in the primary for people who are taking you on. There's one of my old friends from Indiana. I just loved him dearly. Dick Lugar was a real moderate, bipartisan senator that I worked with a lot. For a while, they were using his name as a verb. People would say, I got Lugared, because he lost in a primary, because he was too bipartisan. He's not the only one. There are many others now who have also lost their primaries on the right and on the left because they were too bipartisan. As a founder of the Bipartisan Policy Center, you wouldn't believe the number of times people have said, well, I'm happy to work with you, but you can't let I don't want it public that I'm working with you because I'll get primaried. They used to say I'd get Lugared. And that's a shame. that's really a shame. That's an indication of how far we've come, and how dangerous this whole situation is. As I currently listen to the election cycle and the ads, I listen to very little TV because I can't take the television ads. I used to joke that they interrupt ads with programs these days. There's so many of them. And I think that's really what another thing that is wrong politically that we've got to address is how much money goes into politics today. It's way, way more expensive than it's ever been before. A typical competitive House race is somewhere between $7 and $8 million now. A Senate race can cost upwards of $200 million. And there's increasing quid pro quoism in our democracy, where money given is money expected in result. And I think that's very dangerous for democracy.
I grew up in Indiana and actually met Senator Lugar when I went to D.C. Around the time I was entering high school. My grandmother took me there. She was involved with politics and the civic government local to myself, and she took me there, and we met Senator Lugar. The impression that I got was very similar to your experience with him, and your time working together, is just that he genuinely cared about his constituents, regardless of their party. He wanted to make life better for them, and he wanted to help solve their problems, and knew that it was going to take working together to get there. So I really appreciate that. And I know he had the Lugar Center, which for a while was actually maintaining a bit of an index on the bipartisan efforts by individual politicians. Do you know of any other groups, or does the Bipartisan Policy Center maintain any sort of indexing or information on how actively bipartisan individual politicians are?
Well, the Bipartisan Policy Center actually does give an award every year to a Republican and a Democrat who have demonstrated bipartisanship over the year, and I really think that's such a great idea. I don't know if any other organization does that kind of research and indexing, but I'm sure it's available somewhere. I have to share one Dick Lugar story, that an idea that I've taken on. I used to give him credit, but it's been enough years now where I take it on as my own idea, but I occasionally will give him credit, and he certainly deserves it. Dick gave me the idea many years ago that the way we ought to start every year is the president should invite the four leaders, the two House leaders, the two Senate leaders, to Camp David for a week, right around the holidays. And they ought to, not necessarily for a week, but for whatever number of days it would take, for the five, maybe with including the vice president, the six leaders of our country, to come together and say, what is it that we can accomplish together this coming year? And make some decisions about priorities for which everyone could agree. And then during the State of the Union, the president would announce every year, here's what we've agreed to, before they get into their own agendas. I always thought that's such a great idea. Start with the things you can agree on, and then propose ideas that you hope you could still find agreement on, but at least put something in the bank as you start. And I just think, as I say, Dick Lugar came up with the idea. I've taken it on as my own now, but I just think that it's something I've recommended it now to three presidents, and I haven't gotten very far with it, but I really think it's worth considering.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. The reason we're called A Common America is because we recognize that there's about 10 or 11 core issues that most Americans agree need to be solved. And so if you had that process at, State of the Union, where both parties announce this is what we're going to focus on together this term, that would be really, really helpful. I'm hoping, or we're hoping as an organization, that over time, the gridlock in Washington is going to drive the center of the country, not the, as we talked about, the extreme right and left, but the center of the country to finally take action, which is why we have done that, right? There's lots of organizations that are pushing, but the lack of action on immigration reform and healthcare reform, and I mean, the list goes on, women's right to choose right now. I mean, there's lots of these topics that we're hoping, and again, hope is not a strategy, but we're really hoping that it'll get bad enough where the center, I should say, not the middle, the center of the country politically will actually start to drive and push towards getting some consensus, getting some compromise, pushing their leaders in Congress to actually go off and try to find compromise across the aisle and see if something can be made to address the concerns that Americans have. Right now, we just feel like, for the most part, in the House especially, we looked at the immigration bill that the Senate tried to put together with Biden last year and how that fell apart. We're hoping that enough pressure we put on some of these people, and if we elect some new centrists to the House, that maybe more legislation will come out.
Well, Mark, that's such an important goal, and I applaud you both for making the effort. I have to say, we get what we deserve, and if people aren't willing to participate in the primary process, and if we're not willing to push back when state legislatures gerrymander and Congress gerrymanders the way they do, and if we aren't willing to take on the whole money issue, I'm concerned. I've often been in conversations over dinners and in all kinds of settings with students in particular. I do a number of student classes, high schools and colleges throughout the year. And these questions oftentimes come up. And I worry sometimes that it might take an inflection point for us to generate the kind of consensus around these important goals. I hope it doesn't take an inflection point. I hope it, in other words, a crisis of some kind that is of a magnitude that just drives everyone to the determination to change the way things are going. But I think right now we're trending in the wrong directions, and we've really. I think we've got to be focused on that and recognize that things could get worse before they get better.
Yeah, I was going to ask you if you see anything short of an inflection point that could be the trigger to come back, or at least be open to listening to the center, whether that's among our elected politicians or even in, more civic society and local government. Any thoughts of anything short of an inflection point that might be the spark or the impetus for that?
Well, I guess the alternative is what I would call the small victory approach. Mm-hmm. And that's really kind of what you're attempting to do is chalk up small victories along the way and encourage in as many ways as possible in elections, and then, of course, in legislative sessions, finding that common ground. And I'm involved with a number of organizations like yours. I chair the National Institute for Civil Discourse. I'm on a board. Senator Kennedy asked me to be on his board, the EMK, the Edward M. Kennedy Institute, and we work very closely with the McCain Institute and the Hatch Institutes to create bipartisan consensus around issues. And I think we've made some progress. The institutes have hosted a series of debates. We just had one not long ago again, where a Republican and a Democrat bring back the tradition of debates that we used to take for granted in the Senate, but don't see much of anymore. And but we're hosting a series of these in the hope that we can revive an interest and again just sort of bring people to an appreciation of how enlightening and how enjoyable those debates can be. The format is pretty simple. We take an issue or a series of issues and let people debate, but at the end we try to encourage both debaters to say, okay, where would be the common ground? After you've kind of laid out your case for your position, where do you think we might find some common understanding or approach that could serve as the vehicle for real compromise and progress going forward? That's kind of thing is what I would consider a small victory approach, but we need a lot of those small victories.
Yeah, we call that the 80% approach. So you're not going to get everything you want, but maybe close to 80%, which is probably optimistic. I understand, but would you talk about that? I brought up immigration reform earlier. So that clearly is a hot button for the current election cycle. And, you know, GM and I are old enough to have seen various attempts at this since, I guess, since Ronald Reagan, maybe, or at least I'm old enough to remember that. You made some attempts during your tenure in the Senate to kind of push something through. And then we saw this attempt last year as well with Senator Langford and Sinema and others. What, you know this area very well. I mean, what do you think there's an 80% possibility for immigration reform, at least maybe after this election cycle, to get pushed forward? Is that possible? What's your opinion on that?
I don't know if I'd give it an 80%. I definitely think there's a 50%, just because it's so important. It's so necessary. That bill that the Senator Langford and others found compromise on was really a remarkable piece of work. I was really impressed with it, and frankly, I give the Democrats a great deal of credit because they also made enormous concessions to get to a point where you could really compromise. But we all know the components. There's no mystery to it. There's got to be a security component. There has to be a dreamer component. There has to be a migrant worker component. And there has to be a way to address legal immigration in a way that accommodates the increasing and growing demand. But there also has to be a realization that we're a nation of immigrants, and it's really our strength. I mean, it's one of the reasons we're continue to grow in our population is not because of our birth rate. That's going down, but it's because of our immigration. And other countries have not been able to accommodate that growth, in part because they don't have the immigration opportunities that we do. So I just really think that I'd love to see us pick up where they left off. I mean, I you don't have to agree with this. I think they killed it because Trump wanted to have a political victory, and he didn't want them to be able to claim an accomplishment. And that happens oftentimes in elections. It's not the first time, and it probably, in fact, I can guarantee it won't be the last. But it was a tragedy to lose that momentum and all the good work that went into that, because I think everyone in that room participated in good faith with every expectation that it would lead to a vote, and they were denied that opportunity, and I think that's really unfortunate.
That was the thing that was so striking to me, is even the perception that it could be a victory just for one party when it was so collaborative. It truly, there was something in there that everyone could find to celebrate as a victory for both Republicans and Democrats, and even just advancing and making making compromise to yield progress is a victory in and of itself. So that's the unfortunate part, is that it would have been perceived as a victory just for one, or the notion of that. I think that's probably a good transition to touch ever so briefly on the current presidential election and your thoughts on especially the recent changes that have occurred in candidates on the Democratic side. But what are your thoughts of the presidential election that we have in front of us today?
Well, I know it probably, I'm sure your other guests have articulated how important this election is. I think it's the most important election of my lifetime. It's almost trite to say that. I'm sure I've said that in almost every election I've participated in, whether I was a candidate or. But I really think you have to go all the way back to Lincoln's election. I feel that strongly about the consequences of this election. I worry a great deal about the fragility of our democracy and the rule of law, and what it could mean to actually elect a convicted somebody convicted of a felony. Just there's so many aspects to this that are, not to mention January 6th and just what what happened that day alone. That in itself ought to be disqualifying. So, I take off my if I can take off my partisan hat and just say, for the sake of democracy, I just hope that this election can be successfully functioned and that democracy can be prevailed. I'm not as concerned about who takes the House or the Senate, although I obviously would love to see the Democrats do well in both. I think it's unclear today how that is going to turn out. I think it's conventional wisdom has it that because Republicans are numerically advantaged in this election in the Senate, there's more of an opportunity for them to regain control of the Senate. But the House is really up for grabs and could go either way. And there's, as we speak, there's about 95 days left before the election, and anything can happen, as it already has this year. This has been probably the most unpredictable and the most historic turn of events that any of us have seen in our lifetimes, and you could almost argue that anybody has ever seen in American political history. So we're experiencing history day by day, and it's quite an experience.
It seems like this is it's another election where the moderate middle or the independents, how they show up, how they end up, looking at the issues and casting their votes. It's going to be consequential in this election for sure, and hopefully there's enough that motivates them to get off the couch and make their way to the election precinct and cast their vote or mail in their ballot. That just feels like it's a very consequential piece of the election this year.
Absolutely, Jim. I would say that it's not an exaggeration to say that the moderate independent voters in 6 swing states are going to determine the outcome of this election. So they have never been more important or more pivotal. It's that clear. I mean, both candidates have around 45% of the electorate. You've got 10% that claim to be undecided, and in many of those swing states, it's probably even less than that. So it's going to come down to a few thousand votes in swing states across the country. 6 swing states to be clear, maybe more. Still don't know how the election's going to play out, but you're absolutely right. It's the moderates, it's the middle, it's the undecided voter today who's not engaged politically and open to listen and to reason, and I would hope that the message to each of them is to go vote and to don't stay home. Recognize how important this vote is, and voting starts, of course, in some states in just a few weeks, actually, early September. So the voting is not just on election day. It's for a lot of states, it begins in September.
I think you mentioned the kind of balance of Congress as well, in addition to the presidential election. And being in Montana, it's interesting to watch, talking about moderates, it's interesting to watch what's going on with Jon Tester. So, John, in my opinion, I've been out of Montana since I was young. I'm back this last year, but I watch politics here. And Jon Tester, as a Democrat, has served, I believe, constituents really, really well here, even though he's a Democrat and it's a red state. So he's done a great job for a long period of time. But, McConnell and team are funding, Tim Sheehy to change that. And I feel like it comes down to, when I talk to people here in Montana, it comes down to they're just trying to clear the slate of any Democrat in the state. I think South Dakota is a similar situation, Senator, that you mentioned earlier. but it's just too bad. I'm hoping that even here in Montana, that 5 or 10% will show up and recognize that he's not a Republican, but he's been a really good supporter of Montana in general, and they'll recognize that's more important than what his party affiliation is. We'll see what happens. I think that and one or two other Senate races is going to, as you said, potentially move that or flip it. So I'm hoping that I'll say normal or reasonable will prevail in some of these Senate elections. I'm not sure about the House at all.
Well, I hope I couldn't agree more about Jon Tester. I know him well and strongly support his candidacy. What troubles me is the trend we've seen in the last 20 years on straight ticket voting. You probably have heard this, but I think it's quite remarkable. In 2016 and 2020, there have been 68 races in the country that have included a president and a Senate candidate. In 67 of those 68, the same party won. Susan Collins in Maine is the only exception in those 68 races. I hope Jon Tester is one of those in 2024, and Sherrod Brown and others. But you're right. He deserves it. He works hard. He's a hands-on farmer and looks the role of farmer and is a farmer, and I think certainly deserves re-election.
Yeah.
So, Senator, maybe talk a little bit about your focus areas today, and any detail you can share on the initiatives and what you're working on, and if there's any way we can support your efforts.
Well, thanks for asking. I have a number of areas that I spend a lot of time on. I have a consulting business where we get to work on a lot of public policy issues, and I get to work with my son who really runs it. But then I'm on probably too many nonprofits, and I chair a number of them. I'll just kind of go through some of them because I think they all deserve recognition and support. One that I probably takes most of my time. I chair the National Democratic Institute. It was created by Congress to promote democracy worldwide. We're in 57 countries right now and have about 1,300 employees working for democracy, and we badly need support and help, and I'm very proud of the work that NDI does. The Bipartisan Policy Center, we founded that. George Mitchell, Howard Baker, Bob Dole, and I founded it in 2007. Its only purpose as a think tank is to bring both parties together and to find common ground. I'm really impressed by all the work they do, and proud to be a founder of that organization. I'm also co-chair on the National Institute for Civil Discourse. That organization is dedicated again to finding common ground and doing as much as possible. Christy Whitman is my co-chair, and really is a fantastic co-chair. She was the governor of New Jersey a couple of decades ago. And then I'm also on the board of the World Food Program USA, where we try to feed the hungry around the world. We've about almost 700 million people go to bed hungry every night. We lose about 25,000 people a day to hunger in the world today, and it's just tragic. We have the food, but 30% of our food is wasted. 30% of the food produced doesn't get to market. So we have a lot of institutional and infrastructural issues that prevent us from feeding the world, and we need to do a better job of that.
The thing I like about all of those groups and many of the other ones that you're working on is that they are such hopeful views into the future, and they're ways to really bring people up and bring people together. And I think so much of people's apathy about elections and politics is because they sometimes lose hope in the future. And I think that efforts like these can give people hope for the future, can give people hope that we can solve a lot of these big problems, whether it's food insecurity or others that you've mentioned. What other things give you hope that you would, just help people become aware of, or what gives you hope in politics for the future?
I think what gives me hope more than anything, of course, and I'm sure you've heard this from others, but when I talk to young people, I'm really inspired by their idealism. I have 6 grandchildren, and we just had lunch yesterday with our one of our granddaughters, and she is so smart and so committed and so dedicated. And I have a couple of grandsons in college. She's in college as well, but they all, and I have another grandson currently working at the Democratic Convention. But all 4 of those, and then I have 2 younger ones, want to give back. They want to contribute. They want to make life better for the world and the country and for democracy. And I just love their passion and their commitment to doing well and doing good. And they're not uncommon. I mean, every grandparent, I'm sure, has justifiable pride in their grandchildren, and I certainly do, and my wife and I both do. But I have to say that isn't unique. As I say, I talk to classes, high school classes, college classes quite often. I'm impressed. I'm blown away by their questions, by their logic, by their desire to want to give back and be a part of something bigger than themselves. If there's any sort of sense of hope that I get from almost any other source, I can't think of any source more compelling than I get from the youth.
That's perfect. We're hopeful that they will be more active than maybe some of the rest of us have been over the years. So we feel the same energy around the young people we speak with as well. So we're hopeful for the same reasons. Senator, we wanted to thank you for all your service. As I said, I'm former military as well, so I wanted to say for your military service, as well as your work for the country, the Senate, the House, all the things you've done, all the things you volunteer on, all the board time. Thank you so much for that, and supporting bipartisanship in the U.S. We're going to do our tiny share of trying to move things more towards collaboration, empathy. We'll do that, but what you've done for the country is amazing. So thank you again, and thank you for being on the podcast with us.
Oh, that's very kind, Mark and Jim. Thank you for inviting me, and continue to keep up your good work. It's really important, and any way that you think I can help along the way, by all means, let me know.
I appreciate that. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.